to call attention now to the fact that the public law of Europe at the present day is no longer that of the Middle Ages. So the popes no longer depose sovereigns, nor do sovereigns dream of restoring the feudal system. Remember, in that system, we explained it before, but as a reminder, the feudal system was based on oaths of fealty. And oaths are ultimately a spiritual thing. And the church, of course, therefore has jurisdiction over them. And the spiritual authority can dispense anyone from an oath. The Pope certainly, and what powers belong to a local ordinary or to the pastor of a parish, are dictated by the laws of the church, but all of that is 100% most definitely under the jurisdiction of the Pope. And he can dispense anybody from an oath that he has taken, even legitimately. A legitimate binding oath, the Pope can dispense from that for any sufficient reason, any reason he sees fit. And certainly if some sovereign is badly misbehaving to the point that he ought not to be obeyed anymore, then the Pope can, in a system which relies completely on such oaths of fealty as the title of obedience, he can dispense everybody from those oaths, and therefore dispense them from their obedience, thereby effectively removing the authority from that ruler. So instead of opinions have changed with custom, so perhaps that's true, it doesn't really bear upon what we're looking at here, but our author still puts an observation in there at that point anyway. So instead of the pontifical supremacy, the revolutionary principle of popular sovereignty, following in the train of Protestant ideas, has made its way into the minds of the masses, and now the right of setting up and overthrowing governments and rulers. So that this is, it's not truly vested in the power of insurrection. That's the idea, that this is the sense in which that democracy is condemned, actually, as a condemned ideology, not as a possibly functional form of government. Democracy, the church doesn't really care in principle. But as an evil ideology, democracy is condemned with this idea that the power rests primordially in the people, that they can take it back whenever they very well please. There are some, as far as was of the opinion that one could overthrow a tyrant. St. Thomas says no, as far as is of the opinion that one could overthrow a tyrant. But even then, it has to be someone who's actually a tyrant, and even according to that system, which was probably not correct. In any controversy, Suarez was wrong, pretty much. So definitely better to follow St. Thomas in that. So, but even according to Suarez's ideas, it still requires that there be an actual tyrant, not under any circumstances, take it back whenever. Whereas according to, yes, Protestantism, it is the political application of the principles of Protestantism to the political order. This idea that the people can have the power primordially, and then that they can take it back whenever they want to. And they have to delegate it to some person or smaller group of people, just because the masses can't exercise authority on their own. That's just impractical. So they have to, at least in a practical sense, they have to give it to somebody else. But that they can take it back whenever they want because it's really theirs. That is false. That is definitely condemned. So all of the different systems on that are for other courses, but that is definitely, you can see how that comes from Protestantism, also how that's condemned along with the ideas of Protestantism. Again, if every individual receives a personal inspiration of the Holy Ghost to interpret sacred scripture on his own, why not then also have the power to invest anybody with the authority to rule and take it back whenever as well? Why not? It's a greater thing, obviously, to infallibly interpret divine revelation than it is to pick somebody to rule. So you can see how that very naturally grows out of that. So you see that the influence of Martin Luther is in all areas these days, in ways that most people don't even realize. Most people have probably heard the name Martin Luther at one time or another, but most people probably know next to nothing about him, what he actually said and did. But everybody is under his influence these days, or to an enormous extent, anyway. So you also see Protestantism manifested in the philosophical order, if you want to call it that, in Immanuel Kant. Essentially, the idea that the mind determines reality. And if the mind can determine on its own what divine revelation means, again, why not everything? And that's where you get Kantianism. So there's a lot more to it than that, but that is the basis of it. So there is no such power of insurrection in reality, but that's the idea. According to the ideas of Protestantism, there is, which just shows the falsity of it. So the point being that the general perception, the point that our author is really making here, I don't think with the greatest clarity, but the point he's making here is that the system at the time was very different from what we have now. And he's even speaking from the 19th century. It's still essentially the same now as then. And indeed, the entire system is quite different. We're looking at, right now, we're looking at the 11th century at the Catholic Middle Ages, when the principles that we're talking about were generally accepted. That the basis of civilization was the Catholic faith, and certainly in Western Europe. So in historical light, at least the system of the Middle Ages was quite equal. So whatever he means by that. In fact, the system worked better. It's a much better system in itself. You see, any difficulties that arose in the Middle Ages are all accidental difficulties, not due to the system itself. Nowadays, it's completely the opposite. Anything good that arises in nations that have the principles of the revolution at their foundation, any good that arises in those nations is the accidental thing. Whereas in the Middle Ages, it was anything bad was accidental. So you hear people complaining about disadvantages of the guild system, for example. When you listen to it closely, there may have been indeed abuses in some places. That no system is going to be perfect in the sense of not involving anybody who's troublesome. But you listen to what those complaints are, it's clear that they were all accidental problems, that the system is good in itself, and that any problems arose from the fact that just a fallen human nature is still involved in it. Whereas again, today it's the other way around. So you go into that a lot more. But the point is that at the time the system was perfect, and if in itself much better than anything today. And any difficulties, there are still difficulties, but those do not prove the defective system. So St. Gregory VII was loath to act with precipitation in a matter involving such serious consequences. Because absolutely speaking, he could act with whatever speed he wants. And the Pope could dispense with any oath he wants to at any time. And that's that, absolutely speaking. But questions of prudence are still involved. And of course, a Pope will have to answer for how he used his powers, whether he used them prudently or not. And you could point to instances of popes doing things that were arguably imprudent. Arguably. Absolutely speaking, having the power to do it, but in some cases, at least, arguably being imprudent. So he doesn't want to cause a greater evil still by using this too quickly, by dispensing everything and potentially plunging a whole nation into civil war, for example. That would give. So he could technically dispense everybody from their oaths of allegiance to Henry IV, and then they would no longer be bound to that. They could proceed to the election of a new monarch, or however another monarch is chosen, and he would be legitimate, that replacement. But at the same time, Henry might retain, for whatever reason, the loyalty of some of his formerly legitimate subjects, and they could end up at odds, even in armed conflict, and then you have a whole nation in civil war, and that's even worse than to have a bad ruler, but certainly legitimate. Everybody agrees on the legitimacy of Henry, that they're still obeying him and everything legitimate, even if he's just as horrible as he could be, pretty much. Everybody could always be worse, but he's just, especially given the general circumstances of the times, his behavior is just absolutely inexcusable. Even so, as bad as he is, he's, at the moment that we're looking at right now, definitely recognized as legitimate, and deposing him would cause worse evils if it were not to have the desired effect. So we must display the simplicity of the dove as well as the prudence of the serpent. The synod met again on the next day. The Pope, in a solemn address, recalled his endeavors to bring back Henry IV to a line of conduct more in keeping with the dictates of prudence and more worthy of a Christian ruler. That's about the nicest possible way he could phrase that. The bishops called for a sentence of excommunication. Then the Pope stood up, and amidst the deepest silence, broken only by the repeated acclamations of the council, spoke as follows: Saint Peter, Prince of the Apostles, hear thy servant. I call thee to witness, thou and the most holy Mother of God, with Saint Paul thy brother, and all the saints, that the Church of Rome compelled me in spite of myself to rule. So remember, he did not want to, Hildebrand did not want to take upon himself the papacy. But he finally yielded to the appeals of the Church that he do so. That's what he's referring to there. So in the name of Almighty God, Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, and by thy authority, I forbid Henry to govern the German realm and Italy. I release all Christians from the oath by which they have bound themselves to him, and I forbid anyone to serve him as king. Since he has refused to obey as a Christian, rejecting the counsels given him for his salvation, and withdrawing from the Church which he seeks to rend, I hereby declare him anathema, that all nations may know, even by experience, that thou art Peter, and that upon this rock the Son of the living God has built his church, against which the gates of hell shall never prevail. So, that phrasing can hardly be improved upon there. But notice he does specify that Henry seeks to rend the unity of the church, which of course cannot actually be done. Whenever anyone is cast out of the church through excommunication or severs himself from it by schism or heresy, indeed he separates himself from the unity of the church, but it cannot be rent or destroyed or anything like that. Not in itself. Some might leave it, but it remains one nonetheless. So again, in no sense can it be rent. So a pontifical bull acquainted the whole Catholic world with the sentence pronounced against Henry IV. If by the grace of God, said the Pope, he show true repentance, he will ever find us ready, notwithstanding all his attacks upon us, to receive him back into the communion of the Church. He may then be convinced that we love him far more sincerely than those who now share or encourage his crimes. So he's speaking of showing true charity here. Charity, or as it can be called love. It's a term that it's a word that is often abused these days, obviously, but true love in itself just means to will good towards someone, and that can be with zero emotional engagement. It could be with emotional ice coldness, in fact, but still will good towards someone. And so, indeed, by inflicting this penalty, which has as one of its aims a medicinal effect, indeed, the Pope is showing much greater charity towards Henry IV than anybody who might be encouraging him in doing what he's doing. So the news of Henry's excommunication and deposition caused an immense sensation in the Catholic world. Germany was at once divided into two camps, so that's foreseeable. But St. Gregory VII reached the conclusion that this was unavoidable, that there's just no other course of action, that Henry was just not behaving himself, and he was not going to mend his ways. So the only thing to do is go with the nuclear option, so to speak, excommunication, and dispense his subjects of obedience to him. So, predictably, it wouldn't exactly take a prophet to predict that would cause division in the nation, over which Henry has been ruling, but just unavoidable at this point. So Germany was in fact then divided at once into two camps. The cause of the Pope was upheld by a considerable number of clerics, monks, and nobles, by Franconia, Bavaria, Swabia, that should be written with a W-U, S-W-A, Swabia, Lombardy, and the whole of Saxony and Thuringia. So that's an older way of spelling Swabia. Henry at first endeavored to hide the pain caused by this blow. He pretended to slight the pontifical sentence as a powerless attack. So first tried to blow it off, as they say. His rage broke out ever more violently than ever upon the wretched Saxons. So we're talking about Saxons living in Saxony, not the Anglo-Saxons. Saxony and Thuringia, says a contemporary historian, were ravaged with a barbarous cruelty unequaled in the memory of any living man. But defections began to multiply among the adherents of a king whose power was made subservient to injustice and tyranny. A solemn gathering of the German bishops and nobles was held at Stribor near Mentz. 2 papal legates were present, so Sicard, Patriarch of Aquileia, and Altman, Bishop of Passau. They announced on behalf of the Holy See that Henry, being canonically excommunicated, the support of the pontifical authority might be relied upon in the election of a new king. So after 7 days of deliberation, the assembled princes decided upon the necessity of giving a new ruler to Germany. But Henry, becoming alarmed at the fearful proportions which the question was now assuming, entered into active negotiations with the leading members of the Diet of Tribur and promised to make all satisfaction that might be required of him. So clearly it shook him into the excommunication and dispensation of his subjects from their oaths of fealty. That had some effect. I mean, we'll see to what exactly extent that effect went, but some extent clearly. But Henry, becoming alarmed at a treaty was concluded. The nobles announced to Henry that unless within the space of a year he had obtained absolution from the sentence of excommunication and deposition weighing upon him, he should be considered finally deposed from the throne. They then dictated to him the severest terms, the chief of which were that he should disband his army and withdraw to Spires, laying aside the royal authority until he had received absolution from the sovereign pontiff. So a diet was likewise convoked at Augsburg, at which the Pope was invited to be present to end the affair. St. Gregory set out at once, but instead of awaiting him in Germany, Henry came forward to meet him at Canossa, so a famous castle of Canossa, one of the castles in the domain of the Countess Matilda. So it's in northern Italy. The meeting was attended with somewhat remarkable circumstances. So the castle of Canossa, says a particular author named Voigt, was surrounded by a triple line of outworks, so fortifications of various variety, or some variety here. In the second of those, Henry was admitted, while the lords of his train were left outside of the first. The king had laid aside every badge of royalty. There was nothing to betray his rank. Clothed in penitential dress and barefoot, he spent 3 days in fasting and prayer, awaiting the sentence of the sovereign pontiff. So our author points out here that in the footnote that Protestant and infidel writers are apparently much shocked at the rigor and arrogance, and he puts a seek right there to show that that's what they say, that these authors call it arrogance. In other words, I'm just quoting them. Don't blame me for it. I found it thus, seek meaning thus. So that's just I'm just quoting it, is what our author is saying, and putting that seek right there. In itself doesn't make any sense. It's wrong. Sometimes you see that when in a quotation there's a grammatical error or spelling error, or it just doesn't make sense what's being said. But the author whose work is quoting the thing that doesn't make sense or is wrong or whatever puts that seek there to say, look, I found it like this. Don't put the spelling errors on me, or whatever it happens to be. The fact this makes no sense, don't put that on me. I'm quoting it as I found it. So, the seek. So shocked at the supposed rigor and arrogance with which St. Gregory treated Henry IV, obliging him to wear a penitential garb and undergo a fast of 3 days before giving him absolution. Well, arrogance, that's this is something that clearly it's not new, but sometimes when people have a predetermined end in mind, a conclusion that they're bound and determined to reach, they'll start mind reading and start leveling all kinds of accusations they can't possibly justly substantiate when they want to just paint whoever it is they're attacking as evil. And so arrogance, that's something that's a personal problem. This is something that, absolutely speaking, the Pope has the authority to do. Yet remember, in the hierarchy of the Church, the emperor is a layman. A young seminarian who's just received tonsure is at a higher level in the hierarchy of the Church than the emperor, who hasn't. Unless the emperor himself has been admitted to tonsure in minor orders, obviously, that's another thing. Or to even if you were to be ordained a deacon or something like that. But definitely, an excommunicated emperor is lower than anybody else. I mean, he's outside the Church completely. So definitely, he's not even a member of the Church being excommunicated at this point. So he's below even just a regular layman who is just a good Catholic at this point. So there's no arrogance. It's not in itself an arrogant course of action to require a penitent sinner, especially somebody who's so grievously and publicly sinning the way Henry is sinning, to require such a penitent to do public penance. And even today, in today's world, imagine a true pope appearing on the scene. Somebody who has sinned as badly as this would be required to do public penance. Now, yeah, definitely the church has greatly mitigated the penances that were once imposed, but some things can only be dealt with by means of severity. Some things are just so bad that they can only be dealt with by means of severity. That's why, for example, child abusers would just be, it would not be unjust what the state might choose to do in any given case, as is dictated by prudence, but in itself, to have the death be the penalty for child abusers, that's not too severe in itself. That ought to be the regular thing. If the state wants to deter people from that, they can put that down as the regular penalty, and that would not be too severe. That would have the effect of turning people away. So, yeah, some penalties for some crimes are just, it's not too severe. So, public penance, while the church, of course, doesn't want to turn people away from doing penance, it is also necessary to see to it that actually that there be some kind of proportion between the penance and the offense. Even in the confessional, the confessor has to keep that in mind when assigning the penance for any particular penitent. Is what was just confessed, and therefore what is. There's no, absolutely speaking, it's not a proportion between the penance and the sin. Obviously, the sin being an infinite offense against God, definitely if it's a mortal sin. But still, there has to be some kind of, for greater sins, greater penance. It's just basic justice there, really. So there's nothing in itself arrogant about making a deposed monarch who's showing himself to be just absolutely horrible and excommunicated. There's nothing arrogant in itself about making such a person do public penance. So these writers betray ignorance of facts, that should be, and of laws. It was Henry's own thought to clothe himself as a penitent. In fact, he did that willingly. And to practice this fast while seeking forgiveness for his crimes and criminal attempts. So in law, the discipline of the church relative to canonical penances sanctioned this species of expiation. So there's nothing wrong with it in itself. And in fact, Henry willingly underwent it. So greater princes than Henry IV had submitted to it. What Theodosius had done before St. Ambrose, the king of Germany, might well repeat without dishonor before St. Gregory VII. That's a reference to the Emperor Theodosius at one point. Long story short, the emperor had enacted a massacre in a city in Greece. Thessalonica, I believe, was the city. And he had to do public penance for that. Definitely the city had been misbehaving, but he went way overboard in punishing the city for its offenses. Way overboard. And St. Ambrose very famously, again, the birth of Theodosius, we're talking about the emperor who outlawed paganism in the Roman Empire. So really became, either became or became much closer to being a Catholic state, the Roman Empire, under the Emperor Theodosius. And even he, he's known as Theodosius the Great. Even he had to undergo public penance. St. Ambrose. And actually, in turn, St. Ambrose held up to him the example of King David, who had to do penance himself for sins, certain sins. Great as he was, King David, it's rather surprisingly and rather suddenly, when you read the account of it, fell into very grave sins in the books of Kings. And apparently without, even after all the favors he received from God, however, after having been earlier in his life in a figure of Christ, still committed very grave sins with apparently almost no qualms of conscience. It's a very shocking thing in a way when you read the account. Very suddenly fell into adultery and then murder right after that, and then didn't seem bothered by it much. Until eventually his conscience was woken up and he did do penance, but before that he just didn't seem much to care, or care much at all. So, it happened to King David, even. So the Emperor Theodosius indeed underwent public penance, being actually forbidden at the doors of the church by St. Ambrose from entering till he did penance. And that was why since woke him up, because that St. Ambrose publicly forbade him entrance into the church after what he did. So majesty is never disgraced by humbling itself before God. Obviously, the authority of majesty comes from God himself, who is the source of all authority and all things good, including authority. So Theodosius, though on his knees at the feet of St. Ambrose, is nonetheless honored in history by all ages as Theodosius the Great. So, there you have that. Just keep in mind that you might hear these kinds of things. All the arrogance of Gregory VII. He probably wouldn't call him a saint, but they would accuse him of arrogance on this occasion, which was not the case. No personal arrogance either. Obviously, he's a saint. So no person to guarantee you that this is not. If he had shown dissatisfying personal arrogance on this occasion, he would not have been canonized for sure. So remember that the canonization of a saint is not simply a declaration of the person is in heaven. It does include that, and infallibly, but it also includes the infallible declaration that this person's life is in fact a pattern of sanctity to follow. And pretty much any notable failure, at least unrepented for, would prevent that person from being canonized. Yes, sure, there have been great saints who were once great sinners, but they made up for that. So anything that might possibly make the church say, oh, we maybe shouldn't hold this person for a pattern of sanctity to imitate, would be enough to make it so that person would not be canonized. So, all right. So meanwhile, negotiations were rife, so ongoing. In a tumultuous fashion, Matilda became his intercessor with Gregory VII. Henry promised satisfaction. Sometimes things get chopped off here in the transcription. Henry promised satisfaction to all the complaints of his subjects against him, to be present at the Diet of Augsburg, there to make peace with the German princes, by repairing all his past injustice, and he concluded by pledging himself never to undertake anything derogatory to the honor and independence of the Holy See, or Apostolic See. It means the same thing. Prostrate at the pontiff's feet, with his arms outstretched in the form of a cross, and bathed in tears, he uttered the petition, "Forgive, most Holy Father, in your mercy forgive me." St. Gregory raised him up from his humble position, gave him the apostolic blessing and absolution, and celebrated the holy sacrifice in his presence and before all the German nobles who had been introduced and had pledged themselves for the observance of the king's promises. So after the consecration, St. Gregory caused them all to draw near to the altar. Then raising the sacred host, addressed the king, "We have been charged by you and your adherents of having usurped the Holy See, of having acquired it by simony. You have accused us of crimes, which according to the canons would unfit us for the exercise of the sacred ministry. We could easily justify ourselves by an appeal to those who have known us from infancy and to the authors of our promotion, but we invoke the judgment of God alone. May the body of Jesus Christ, which I am about to receive, be then the witness of my innocence. I beseech the Almighty thus to dispel all suspicions, if I am innocent, to strike me dead on the spot if guilty." So, St. Gregory VII saying this. So someone might be inclined to think that it would be this would be to tempt God under ordinary circumstances, but a saint saying it is a different story. In any case, you would presume a pope saying that would be a different story in any case. Even if you were to be present at that, you think of the pope saying that. All right, fine. But now a saint, of course. Probably some special inspiration of the Holy Ghost to do this. He then received one half of the host, and turning again to the king, continued, "Prince, the most serious charges are alleged against you. If you are guiltless, follow my example and receive this remaining half of the sacred host, that this proof may close the lips of all your enemies and forever end the civil strife." And just to show how extraordinary a thing that is, usually the only time when anybody else is allowed to receive half of the large host raised at the elevation of the masses during an episcopal consecration ceremony. When the newly consecrated bishop receives Holy Communion, he receives half of the large host consecrated and elevated. at the very consecration of the Mass. So when anybody else is allowed to do that, and of course the Pope can allow anyone to do it whom he wants. Ordinarily, it's not allowed except in that ceremony. Yeah, or perhaps monarchs sometimes. But even then, I'm inclined to think no. But you have to look at what the Church requires. But that's the most regularly occurring instance of that is at an Episcopal consecration ceremony. Definitely, we can say that. This is just how an extraordinary thing that is. You see right here. So this unexpected proposal startled the king. He was not prepared to commit a deliberate sacrilege. So he's bad, obviously, Henry IV. He's got very little shame, it seems. There are very few lines he won't cross, but apparently this is one of them. So that's good, or maybe he's moved by grace in that moment, just to, in that particular instance, not to. So he begged the Pope to defer the solemn ordeal until the day appointed for the General Diet. So that's already a worrying sign. He begged the Pope, the delay was granted. At the close of the religious solemnity, the Pope invited Henry to his table, treated him with the most marked consideration, and finally allowed him to rejoin his escort, which awaited outside of the castle walls. So all that in 1077. So Henry's reconciliation was but apparent. So this is famously the case, that he waited outside the castle for 3 days, but then he went back to his old ways afterwards. So he bore with him from the domain of the Countess Matilda a heart full of bitter hatred for the Pope, who just, in fact, was treated him very mercifully, but whom he sees simply as having humiliated him. So the flame was fed carefully, having amended his ways, essentially. So, or at least he was actually guiltless. So, this proclamation brought, they made making known to the Catholic world that Henry was released from the censures pronounced against him. This proclamation brought back a number of bishops and nobles to Henry's interest, so back to his support, back to supporting him, that's what that means. The false-hearted monarch saw in this return of fortune but a more favorable opportunity to satisfy his burning thirst for revenge. He sent an armed force into Lombardy, that's a region in northern Italy, named for a tribe, the Lombards, who eventually settled there. So to this day, it's still named for them. So he sent an armed force into northern Italy, into Lombardy, to seize the Pope, but Gregory had received timely warning, and the attempt was foiled. Having once thrown down the gauntlet, Henry felt himself urged on by a new ardor, heartily cursing the past and prepared for a desperate struggle. That was completely turned on, and every sign of repentance he gave before. The German nobles, however, were not disposed to follow him in this course. So good for them. They called the General Diet at Forsheim and sent to request the presence of the Pope. So that's a small town, some distance north of Nuremberg, actually, in Germany. Famous for the Nuremberg trials after World War II, of course, but that's a long time in the future from what we're looking at now. St. Gregory replied that after the late attempt made upon his person by Henry, it would be rash in him to cross the German territory. However, he sent 2 legates to Forsheim. Henry was offered a safe conduct to assist at the deliberations of the Diet. He took care to refuse it. So the council then proceeded to examine the charges brought against him. He was unanimously convicted of a tyrannical abuse of power, while his late assault upon the Pope was deemed a sufficient cause for his deposition. The measure was accordingly proposed by the Archbishop of Mentz, who mentioned Rudolph, Duke of Swabia, as worthy of the royal crown. The motion was received with enthusiastic joy by the princes and people, so they're just happy to be rid of Henry at this point. I mean, he's been horrible, clearly perpetrating atrocities. In any case, even outside of all the trouble he's caused for the church, he's just been a bad civil ruler. The motion was received, so that the legates, presuming upon the views of the sovereign pontiff, confirmed the choice, and in the very same session, the members of the Diet pledged their oath of fealty to the new king. So Rudolph reluctantly bowed his head to receive the royal diadem thus forced upon him. So he himself doesn't really want this, but he goes along with that. He requested a delay that he might take needful counsel. The assembled princes granted him only an hour for deliberation. That was probably not what he was thinking, but it's 1 hour. All right, and before the close of the day, he was proclaimed lawful king of Germany and defender of the empire of the Franks, a title which recalled the days of Charlemagne and the rise of the new empire of the West. Remember, the Franks, of course, for whom France is now named, were a Germanic tribe, actually, originally. Yeah, people moved around a lot. Today's French are definitely not the ancient Gauls. Some are descended from them, sure, but there are plenty of Roman blood, German blood, and not to mention, of course, migration from many other intervening centuries to form the French that are certainly of the Middle Ages, and of course even afterwards. But that's why you would get that. Lawful king of Germany and defender of the empire of the Franks. Right, so the election of Rudolf plunged Germany into new calamities. Henry attacked his rival and defeated him in the first encounter. He would be solemnly crowned at Ulm by way of strengthening his hold upon the scepter disputed by Rudolf, after which he wreaked his vengeance upon Swabia, the domanial province of the new king, ravaging the fields, burning harvests, and leveling the strongholds to the ground. So notice that though the election of Rudolf was not sanctioned by the Pope, who still hoped, in spite of the faithless character of Henry IV, to win back the erring king by gentle means. So, as far as Gregory VII was concerned, perhaps Henry was going back to his old ways, but still, he's have to go through all of the due process first. That those who elected him jumped the gun, as they say. And they wouldn't have said that at the time, but that's what we'd say now. So the legates had exceeded their powers in confirming the election of the Diet. So this has happened in other times in the history of the church, which we've seen legates doing things they weren't supposed to do. Betraying trust. This perhaps was, in itself, a less grievous offense than other instances. But still, I mean, that's bad. Obviously, now they're responsible for plunging to a certain extent, at least, probably more than anybody else, really. They're responsible, telling you to go ahead and do it, in the name of the Pope, go ahead and do this. They've now plunged the nation into civil war. So that was always a possibility, always a risk that everybody do, and one of the reasons why St. Gregory VII didn't want to depose Henry, and only did so, or excommunicated him, released his subjects from their oaths of fealty only as a last resort, precisely for reasons of this nature. So the legates had, in fact, exceeded their powers in confirming the election of the Diet. The pontiff expressly stated the fact in a letter addressed to all the faithful, and declared that the Diet of Horsheim, lacked something missing there, but lacked his direction or advice, or did not have it. Never sought it. So we have even decreed in a council out of the Pope that unless the archbishops and bishops who crowned Rudolf are prepared to give good reasons for the act, they shall be deposed from their sees. So marked was the neutral stand taken by the Pope in this juncture that both kings simultaneously sent ambassadors to solicit his intervention. In reply to these two appeals, St. Gregory VII sent new instructions to his legates in Germany. "We direct you," he wrote by the authority of St. Peter, "to require of the two kings an assurance of our freedom to enter their states, as well as safe conducts that they may enable us, with the help of the German clergy and nobility, to decide in whose hands justice would place the reins of government." Rudolf would gladly have seconded the Pope's wishes, but the unyielding disposition of Henry forbade all hope of a peaceful close. So he pushed on his military operations with renewed energy, and fortune seemed to smile upon his efforts. His cause was embraced by a great majority of the German and Italian bishops. In the opening campaign, victory seemed to hesitate between the two standards. So a bloody battle was fought on the banks of the Struer River in Franconia. Rudolf, stoutly supported by Otto of Nordheim, probably should be Otto, two T's instead of TH. This book likes to use older spellings. of Nordheim, whom contemporary chronicles call a wonderfully brave man, gained one of those dear-bought triumphs, often more disastrous than defeat. Henry fell back upon Ratisbon as a result, so something of a Pyrrhic victory, as they say. In other words, you've won technically, but you're also dead at the same time. Dead, and at least in the sense of having suffered at least as badly in this particular instance. So, fell back to Ratisbon, and after a short delay to repair his shattered strength, once more fell upon Swabia, wasting it with fire and sword. So he's ravaging his own nation. Whether he intends the common good of it at this point is perhaps he might still, but still doing all these horrible things. He's just, Henry IV is just a bad egg, a rotten apple. There's no other way to put it. So, St. Gregory made one more effort to secure peace, or restore peace. He convoked a council in Rome, to which the two kings sent ambassadors, promising to leave the decision of their dispute to a general diet of all Germany. Still, these negotiations did not stay the war, which raged without interruption during the whole of the year 1079. The victory of Fuldenheim, won by Rudolf in 1080, raised the hopes of the Saxons, and seemed to have struck a fatal blow at the cause of Henry. But he rose again, more formidable than ever, and now refused the Pope's mediation and the arbitrament of the General Diet. So the whole of Germany, obviously one word there, besought the pontiff to utter a final judgment between the two rivals, and by his decision end the horrors of civil strife. So it's about perfect timing there. In this period, we will continue on with that next time. See exactly what happens as a result. Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti, men sub tuum presidium confugimus Sancta Dei Genitrix, nostros et precautiones et despicias in necessitatibus, sed periculis contis libera nos semper vigoriosa perdicta. In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti.